I was just a new nurse, 2 months into the job, still finding my way around the sprawling hospital. I'd brought Mrs. Rossi, a sweet elderly woman who spoke only Italian, up to day's surgery for an endoscopy. They'd called down for me, urgently, needing someone to translate and get consent from her family. I'd left them in the waiting room with a promise to check back soon, and had started back down the hall to the ER when I saw her. Standing at the end of the old pediatric wing, her bright white shoes stark against the dull gray floor, she looked so out of place. I'd instinctively assumed she was a family member, maybe a young niece or granddaughter who'd wandered off. "Hey, little girl, what are you doing?" I'd started, my voice hesitant. "You don't need to be over there, you're going to get hurt." I'd stepped forward, intending to gently usher her back towards the waiting room, but as I reached the old nurse's station, she was gone. I hadn't even heard her footsteps fade, or a door creak open. Just nothing. It was like she'd been swallowed by the shadows. A tremor ran through me, a wave of icy cold that left my skin prickling. My eyes darted around, searching for any sign of her, but there was nothing. Just the deserted hallway, empty rooms echoing the silence. Terror clawed at my throat. My legs had turned to jelly, yet I forced myself forward, moving like a robot towards the elevator. The polished steel doors seemed miles away, a distant haven in this growing nightmare. My fingers fumbled with the button, pressing it repeatedly as if my frantic action would speed up the arrival. The wait felt like an eternity, every second stretching into a lifetime. When the doors finally hissed open, I stumbled inside, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I'd made it. I was safe. But as the elevator doors closed, my heart still pounded, a frantic hummingbird in my chest. I couldn't shake the image of the little girl, her bright eyes staring at me from the deserted hallway, her teddy bear clutched in her tiny hand. The ER felt like a sanctuary, the familiar sounds of beeping monitors, the hushed voices of doctors and nurses, a comforting counterpoint to the silence of the pediatric wing. I stumbled towards the nurse's station, feeling like I was going to be sick. "Jesus Christ, what's wrong with you?" Nurse Evans, a woman who'd been at the hospital since the dinosaurs, looked at me with alarm. Her sharp blue eyes scanned my face, taking in my pallor, the tremor in my hands. I tried to explain, my voice a strained whisper. I saw a little girl in the old pediatric hallway. She was just standing there, and then she just vanished." Nurse Evans listened, her expression unreadable. "The pediatric wing?" she repeated. "That's been shut down for years." I know. But I saw her, I swear." I felt tears prick my eyes. The image was still there, vivid, tangible, etched into my mind. Nurse Evans sighed. "You saw the little girl ghost, honey." "The what?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "The little girl ghost." She gestured towards the break room. "The story goes back to the days when the pediatric wing was still open. They say there was a little girl who died in one of the rooms, and her spirit still wanders the halls." I swallowed hard, my head spinning. I had seen her. She had been real. Nurse Evans went on to tell me more. The girl's name was Lily. She was a sweet, timid child who had died during a routine surgery. The story was part of hospital lore, whispered amongst the staff. But no one ever saw her. Not until now. The following weeks were a blur. I did my best to focus on my job, to push away the unsettling image of Lily, but it was impossible. I felt her presence, a whisper of a chill in the air, a fleeting scent of lavender perfume, the echo of a child's laughter in the silence. One morning, I was called to the OR to assist with a procedure. As I entered the operating room, I froze. There she was, standing near the sterile table, her brown dress a jarring contrast to the white walls. Lily. Her eyes were fixed on me, her face an expression of pure innocence, a touch of sadness in her bright gaze. I knew what I had to do. Later that evening, I returned to the pediatric wing. The hallway was still deserted, the air thick with a sense of sadness. I walked towards the room where Lily had died, a small, sterile room with a single bed. I sat down on the floor, my heart pounding. "Lily," I whispered. I know you're here. I saw you. I believe you. I told her about my own childhood, about the loneliness I had felt, the fear of being forgotten. I told her about Mrs. Rossi, her kind smile, her gentle eyes, and I promised that I would help her find peace. I stayed there for a long time, talking to Lily, sharing my own story, letting her know that she was not alone. When I finally left, the air in the hallway seemed lighter, the silence less oppressive. Lily was still there, I knew, but her presence was different. It was one of peace, of acceptance. I never saw Lily again, but I knew she was watching over me. And I knew that sometimes, the whispers we hear in the silence are not always ghosts, but the voices of those who need to be heard. I continued to work at the hospital for another 5 years, and though I never saw Lily again, she remained a part of me, a reminder of the fragile line between the living and the dead, a testament to the power of compassion and understanding. The world of medicine is filled with extraordinary stories, but none as powerful as the one I saw in the deserted pediatric wing, the story of a little girl who needed to be seen, a little girl who needed to be heard. I was assigned to a patient whose mortal journey was drawing to a close. As I entered her dimly lit room, I was enveloped by an atmosphere of hushed anticipation. The patient, a frail woman named Mrs. Emily Carter, lay motionless on her bed, her face a canvas of hardened features. For days she had been unconscious, her body slowly succumbing to the relentless grip of cancer. I settled into a chair beside her bed, my gaze fixed on her waxen face. The silence was deafening, broken only by the steady hum of medical equipment. Hours passed in a monotonous blur as I tended to her physical needs, changing her dressings and administering medications. As the night wore on, the boundaries between reality and the unknown seemed to blur. The dim light cast eerie shadows across the room, creating an atmosphere of foreboding. Suddenly, a faint noise from the corner of the room sent a shiver down my spine. I turned my head slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. Mrs. Carter's bed was empty. Panic surged through me as I frantically scanned the room. Where could she have gone? Then, my eyes were drawn to the top of the bed. There, silhouetted against the faint glow of the nightlight, sat Mrs. Carter. Her eyes were wide open, filled with a desperate plea. "Don't let them take me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I was frozen in place, my body trembling. Who was she referring to? What did she see? "Who's going to take you, Mrs. Carter?" I asked, my voice trembling. Her gaze flickered towards the ceiling, her eyes filled with terror. That black thing up there," she gasped. As soon as the words left her lips, her body convulsed. Her eyes rolled back in her head, and she let out a guttural cry that sent shivers down my spine. Within seconds, her life ebbed away, leaving behind a cold and lifeless shell. I stood there in stunned silence, my mind reeling from what I had just witnessed. What had Mrs. Carter seen? Was it a figment of her dying imagination, or was there something more sinister at play? I rushed out of the room, desperate to escape the haunting presence that lingered in the air. As I ran down the hospital corridor, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just glimpsed the veil between life and the unknown. The next day, I returned to the oncology ward, determined to find out more about what had happened to Mrs. Carter. I spoke to her doctor, a seasoned physician who had witnessed countless deaths during his career. It's not uncommon for patients near the end of their lives to experience moments of lucidity and heightened perception, he explained. They may see or sense things that others can't. He went on to tell me that the black thing Mrs. Carter had mentioned was a common hallucination among dying patients. Some believed it represented the Grim Reaper, while others saw it as a metaphor for the unknown that awaited them. Whether Mrs. Carter's vision was real or not, it had left an indelible mark on me. It had shown me that even in the face of death, there was still so much mystery and the unknown. In the following days, I reflected on my experience with Mrs. Carter. I realized that her dying words had not been a plea for help but a warning. She had glimpsed the abyss that lay beyond this world, and she had been terrified by what she had seen. As I continued my nursing career, I encountered other patients who shared similar experiences. Some spoke of seeing loved ones who had passed away, while others claimed to have had out-of-body experiences. I learned that the dying process was not always a peaceful one, and that there were often layers of fear and anxiety that accompanied it. Over time, I developed a deep respect for the dying and their unique experiences. I made it my mission to provide comfort and support to those who were nearing the end of their lives, and I listened intently to their stories. And so, the memory of Mrs. Emily Carter became a guiding light in my career. It reminded me that even in the darkest of times, there is always hope and that the human spirit is capable of incredible resilience. It also taught me that the line between the living and the dead is not as clear-cut as we might think, and that the mysteries of the unknown continue to beckon us to this day. The sterile air of the hospital ward, usually a reassuring constant, felt heavy and oppressive that night. It clung to me like a shroud as I tended to Mr. Lawson, a frail man in his late 70s, his life ebbing away with each labored breath. His fear was palpable, his eyes wide and unseeing as he fought against the encroaching darkness. He clutched my hand, his grip surprisingly strong for someone so frail. "Don't let them take me," he whispered, his voice a raspy croak. "I'm not ready. I have so much left to do." His fear was a mirror to my own. I had seen death countless times in this hospital, yet each encounter was a reminder of its inevitability, its cold embrace. I did what I could, offering him comfort, holding his hand, and reciting prayers, hoping to ease his terror. For a while, he seemed to calm, his grip loosening, his breathing slowing. A sense of relief washed over me. Maybe, just maybe, he was finally letting go. I rose from the chair beside his bed, my legs stiff from prolonged sitting, and headed towards the nurse's station, 15 feet away. As I sat down, my gaze swept over the ward. I noticed Mr. Lawson's bed, a dark silhouette against the pale walls. It was then I saw it. A black figure stood over him, its form stark against the white linen. It was tall and thin, almost skeletal, with a head that seemed to be shrouded in darkness. It leaned over Mr. Lawson, its presence heavy and oppressive, the air around it chilling. My breath caught in my throat, a strangled gasp escaping my lips. Fear, cold and raw, seized me. It wasn't a shadow, not a trick of the light. It was real, a palpable entity, radiating an aura of pure malevolence. My heart hammered against my ribs, each beat a frantic drum in my ears. I couldn't tear my eyes away, mesmerized by the sinister figure. It felt like an eternity, even though it was probably a matter of seconds before the figure moved. It tilted its head, its shadow-like face turning towards me, and in that moment, a cold wave of dread washed over me, paralyzing me with fear. It felt like I was drowning in terror, the air suddenly thin, my lungs burning. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to escape the chilling presence. But I was frozen, my body refusing to obey my will. Then, as if by magic, the figure vanished. It was gone, without a trace, leaving behind a chilling emptiness that hung in the air like a shroud. I stood up, my legs trembling, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I stumbled back to Mr. Lawson, my mind reeling. My first instinct was to deny it, to convince myself that it was nothing more than a figment of my imagination, a trick of the light. But I knew better. I had seen it, a malevolent entity, standing over a dying man, and I knew instinctively that it was something evil. The following hours passed in a blur. I couldn't focus on anything, my mind fixated on the shadowy figure, the chilling encounter replaying in my mind over and over again. I watched Mr. Lawson closely, but he was resting peacefully, his breathing even and shallow. He had finally let go, peacefully, though my fear lingered, a heavy weight in my chest. I couldn't leave the hospital. The fear was too strong, the memory too vivid. I stayed, clinging to the normalcy of the ward, the constant hum of the machines, the rhythmic beeping, the occasional murmuring of nurses. It was like a shield against the darkness I had witnessed. I confided in a few nurses, my voice trembling as I recounted the events. They listened, some with concern, others with skepticism. A few dismissed it as fatigue, stress, a product of a long and emotionally draining shift. But I knew better. I knew what I had seen. I couldn't shake the feeling that the entity had been drawn to Mr. Lawson's fear, his desperate clinging to life. It was as if it had been waiting, feeding on his desperation, preparing to claim him, to drag him into the darkness. I didn't sleep that night, my mind filled with morbid thoughts. I couldn't escape the chilling image of the black figure, the feeling of its cold, malevolent presence. I desperately wanted to believe it was nothing more than a hallucination, a trick of my overtired mind. Yet a part of me, the part that had seen it, knew it was real. As dawn crept in, casting a pale light over the ward, I finally felt a sense of relief, a shred of normalcy returning. The shadows seemed less threatening, the air less heavy. I could almost convince myself that it had all been a nightmare. But then I saw it again. It was subtle, barely noticeable at first, a flicker of darkness in the corner of my eye, a fleeting shape at the edge of my vision. It was as if the very air around me was alive, pulsing with a sinister energy. The feeling of dread returned, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched, followed. It was as if the entity was always just out of sight, lurking in the periphery, waiting for the opportune moment to strike. The days following that night were filled with anxiety, each shadow seeming to hold a dark secret, each rustle in the corridor echoing with the ominous presence. Sleep was a fleeting visitor, haunted by nightmares of the black figure, the cold touch of its darkness. I sought solace in the familiar routine of the ward, the reassurance of human company. I talked to my colleagues, confided in a few friends, searching for any explanation, any reassurance that would quell the fear that was slowly consuming me. But the fear lingered. It was a constant companion, a dark cloud hanging over me, threatening to consume me. I started to avoid the night shift, the fear too potent in the shadows, the silence too heavy. Weeks passed. I started to feel the fear receding, the terror fading into a hazy memory. The entity seemed to have vanished, the darkness that had enveloped me receding. One day, a new patient was admitted, a middle-aged woman, her face etched with pain and fear. Her name was Mrs. Evans, and she was battling a terminal illness, her days numbered. As I helped her settle into her room, her eyes met mine, and I saw a reflection of my own terror, a desperate plea for solace in the face of inevitable darkness. That night, as I sat by her bedside, listening to her stories, watching her struggle for each breath, I felt the familiar chill, the palpable presence of the darkness. It was faint at first, a whisper in the stillness, but it grew with each passing hour, its presence becoming undeniable. As the night wore on, Mrs. Evans' breathing became raspy, her eyes wide with fear. She clutched my hand, her grip surprisingly strong, her voice a whisper. "Don't let them take me," she said, mirroring Mr. Lawson's words. "I'm not ready. I have so much left to do." And then I saw it again, the black figure standing over her, its presence heavy and oppressive, the air around it chilling. The fear returned, icy and sharp, a knife twisting in my gut. I was frozen, caught in the grip of a terror so profound, so primal, that it robbed me of speech, of movement. The figure leaned over Mrs. Evans, its head tilted, its eyes fixed on me, the cold darkness of its gaze sending shivers down my spine. And then it vanished. Just like that, it was gone, leaving behind an emptiness that felt colder, more profound than before. I sat with Mrs. Evans for the rest of the night, holding her hand, offering comfort, fighting back the rising tide of fear. I couldn't protect her from the darkness, but I could offer her solace, a human connection in the face of the unknown. As the first rays of dawn pierced through the hospital window, Mrs. Evans took her last breath, her face serene, her fear gone. I felt a wave of relief, a sense of closure. The darkness, however, lingered, a chilling reminder of its presence, its power. I left the hospital that morning, my heart heavy, my mind filled with questions. I knew the darkness was real, its presence palpable, its intentions sinister. I knew, too, that it targeted those who feared death, who clung desperately to life, their fear a beacon in the darkness. My job, I realized, was not just to care for the sick, but also to fight the darkness, to offer comfort and solace to those facing the unknown, to hold a light against the encroaching shadows. The fear remained, a constant companion, a chilling reminder of the darkness that lurked in the corners of my world. But so did the hope, the knowledge that even in the face of the unknown, there was still beauty, still light, still a reason to fight. I continued to work as a nurse, each shift a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, each patient a reminder of the fragile beauty of life. I made a conscious effort to reach out to those who feared death, to offer them comfort and reassurance, to show them that even in the darkness, there was still light. And I never forgot the shadows. They were a constant reminder of the forces that lurked beyond our understanding, the darkness that threatened to consume us all. But they were also a reminder of the power of hope, of the strength of the human spirit, of the fight for life, for love, for beauty, even in the face of the unknown. The air in ICU 1 felt different. I can't explain it, but it was like a heavy blanket pressing down on you, the kind that makes you feel suffocated and anxious. It wasn't just the air, though. The room itself felt charged, pulsing with a strange energy that prickled at the back of your neck. It was the kind of room that whispered secrets in the dead of night, stories that made your heart pound and your breath hitch. It had all started with Jake. Jake, a young man whose life had spiraled into a downward spiral, culminating in a crime so heinous it sent shivers down everyone's spines. A murder, cold and brutal, that left a community reeling and a family shattered. Jake, the murderer, ended up in our ICU, his life support a desperate attempt to stave off the inevitable. I remember the day he died. A Tuesday, just an ordinary day in the chaos of the ICU. But that day, the air in ICU 1 felt different. It felt heavier, more oppressive. There was a strange stillness in the room, a silence that wasn't just the absence of sound, but the presence of something more. Something unseen, something unspoken. It wasn't just the air, it was the way the shadows seemed to dance in the room, the way the machines hummed with an eerie constancy, the way the very walls seemed to press inwards, as if trying to contain something that didn't want to be contained. The nurses' whispers started that day. "There's something wrong with that room," they'd say, their voices hushed, their eyes darting around as if afraid of being overheard. "It's just bad energy." They felt it too. The disquiet, the unease. The feeling that something wasn't right. And then, the whispers became stories. Stories of strange occurrences, of equipment malfunctioning, of shadows moving in the corner of the eye. Stories that slowly built a narrative that solidified the room's spookiness. At first, it was just a superstition, a shared fear amongst the nurses. But the more time passed, the more the stories grew, the more the fear spread. Patients started to refuse the room, their families citing a strange, uncomfortable feeling. The fear was contagious. I felt it myself, that creeping dread, the feeling of being watched, even though I knew it was irrational. The air felt thick, the room felt oppressive, and I found myself avoiding ICU 1 whenever possible. One night, a young woman, Sarah, was brought in, her life hanging in the balance after a car accident. The trauma unit was overflowing, leaving ICU 1 as the only available bed. The nurses looked at each other, their faces a mixture of apprehension and anxiety. They knew the stories, knew the whispers, knew the fear that clung to the room. But Sarah needed care, and there was no other option. They prepped the room, scrubbing and disinfecting, trying to banish the unseen presence, trying to erase the memory of Jake. But as they wheeled Sarah in, the air felt heavy again. The shadows still danced, the machines still hummed with an eerie constancy, and Sarah, despite her unconscious state, seemed to flinch, her brow furrowed in a silent grimace. The nurses kept a close watch on Sarah. They checked her vitals constantly, their eyes scanning for any sign of distress. But there was nothing. No change in her heart rate, no spike in her blood pressure, no sign of the fear that they, and I, felt in the room. Sarah's family, though, felt something too. They kept mentioning a bad feeling, a sense of unease, a feeling that something wasn't right. They kept asking for Sarah to be moved, but the hospital was at capacity. The tension in the room was palpable. The nurses moved about with a hushed urgency, their faces drawn and tight. Even the doctors, usually stoic and clinical, seemed to carry a weight on their shoulders. And then it happened. In the middle of the night, Sarah's heart rate plummeted. Her breathing became shallow. Her eyes, though closed, seemed to stir, as if she was trying to escape something. The nurses rushed to her side, their faces pale with fear. They ran tests, administered medications, but nothing worked. Sarah's heart grew weaker, her breathing shallower, until finally, just before dawn, she was gone. The news spread through the hospital like wildfire. Sarah, a young woman full of life, gone in the room where Jake, the murderer, had died. The nurses murmured amongst themselves, their voices filled with dread, their eyes wide with fear. The hospital administration, faced with the escalating fear and the subsequent drop in patient confidence, decided to take action. ICU 1 was officially deemed unusable and closed down. The room was deemed too spooky, the air too heavy, the energy too dark. The hospital's solution was drastic. They knocked out a wall, merging ICU 1 with the hallway, effectively creating a separate entrance into the unit. The room was then designated as an equipment storage room, its history buried beneath stacks of medical supplies and forgotten. I left that hospital shortly after Sarah's death. The fear, the unease, the constant feeling of being watched, had become too much. I needed to escape the weight of the room, to cleanse myself of the lingering memory of Jake and Sarah, and the invisible energy that clung to the room like a shroud. The truth is, I don't know if the air in ICU 1 was truly different, or if the fear was just a collective delusion, a shared paranoia that fed on itself. But I do know that the room felt different, that it carried a burden, a weight that no amount of scrubbing or sanitizing could erase. I left the hospital, but the room, and the story of Jake and Sarah, remained with me. I've worked in other hospitals since then, but I've never encountered a room like ICU 1. Never felt that oppressive air, that unspoken fear, that sense of something unseen, something unspoken. And I hope I never do. Because the truth is, some stories are best left untold, some rooms best left empty, and some memories best left buried. The room might be gone, but the story lives on. It whispers in the quiet corners of my mind, a reminder of the darkness that can seep into even the most sterile of environments, and the invisible forces that can shape our perceptions and our fears. It's a story that haunts me, a reminder that even in the face of logic and reason, the whispers of fear can be powerful enough to shape our reality. And it's a story that I will never forget. As an EMT specializing in interfacility transfers, I've had the unsettling privilege of witnessing the grim underbelly of healthcare in our state. Among the myriad skilled facilities and hospitals I've visited, 3 stand out as beacons of eerie and ominous energy. The first, an abandoned school for the feeble-minded, is a crumbling testament to the dark history of institutionalization. Towering, dilapidated buildings stand like silent guardians, their windows gaping like empty eyes. The air crackles with an oppressive sense of sadness and neglect. I shudder at the thought of the untold stories that linger within those walls. Equally unsettling is the state's prison mental health facility, a foreboding structure that once housed tuberculosis patients in droves. The stench of disinfectant and despair still permeates the corridors, a constant reminder of the suffering that unfolded within. Cells are cramped and windowless, cutting off inmates from any semblance of sunlight or hope. The whispers of tormented minds seem to echo through the halls, a haunting symphony of madness. But perhaps the most unsettling of all is the old birthing hospital, now converted into a long-term care facility. Its once pristine facade conceals a sinister secret. The top floor is shrouded in darkness, padlocked off from the rest of the building. I couldn't resist a morbid joke, asking a nurse on the elevator if the place was haunted. To my surprise, she answered matter-of-factly, yes. There are little kids' shapes playing on the top floor, she confided, her voice hushed. And residents often report seeing older women in long dresses. I refused to go up there alone. Her words sent a shiver down my spine. Curiosity turned to unease as I imagined the specters of a forgotten era wandering the sealed-off corridors. It was as if the cries of newborns and the anguish of mothers had become trapped within those walls, forever echoing their sorrow. One fateful night, I found myself tasked with transporting a patient from the old birthing hospital to a nearby nursing home. As I wheeled the stretcher through the deserted hallways, I felt an inexplicable sense of dread. The air grew heavy, and shadows seemed to dance in the flickering light. Suddenly, a sound caught my ear. It was a faint giggle, barely audible. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Slowly, I turned my head towards the source of the sound. There, in the darkness, a small, shadowy figure hovered. I gasped, my breath catching in my throat. The figure was that of a young girl, her hair flowing down her shoulders like a silken cascade. She had the innocent face of a child, but her eyes held an unsettling depth, as if they had witnessed centuries of pain. Fear paralyzed me as she floated closer, her tiny hand outstretched. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to obey. She reached out and touched my cheek, her touch icy cold. A wave of sadness washed over me, as if she carried the weight of 1,000 broken hearts. Then, as quickly as she had appeared, the little girl vanished, leaving me trembling in the darkness. I stumbled to my feet and continued my journey, my mind reeling from what I had just experienced. I never spoke of the encounter to anyone, but the memory of that night haunts me to this day. The old birthing hospital remains a chilling reminder of the hidden horrors that can lurk beneath the surface of even the most ordinary places. And so, as I continue my interfacility transfers, I carry with me the knowledge of these haunted places, their stories forever etched into my mind. They serve as a chilling testament to the fragility of life and the darkness that can linger long after we are gone.